That's interesting.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center on a day in which the weather essentially matches the mood of our fine city. It's terrific to be in a room with 100 or so people who actually care about evidence. I think when you look at the posturing and chaos that is defining so much of our debate, it's really pretty delightful to be able to have a rich and substantive discussion. Some of you who know us are aware that we have kind of a quaint affinity for fact-based discussion at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And I think it's probably an understatement to acknowledge that many of our government institutions have lost a lot of public trust. Federal agencies, congressional committees, the National Academy of Science, even the Congressional Budget Office has been looked upon differently than it has traditionally been. And so it's, I think, pretty notable that the United States Energy Information Administration is accepted as the foundation upon which we get to have an uproarious and necessary fight about domestic energy policy. I think the EIA's credibility is in some ways all the more remarkable because their task is impossible. I mean, we've all been through the humbling experience of making assertions about what's going to happen in 5 years or even 5 weeks in domestic energy policy. And so, again, the idea that we have a process, I think really speaks to the character of the agency as well as its leadership. And so really it is a great pleasure today to be able to introduce Dr. Linda Capuano, who is the administrator of the EIA. She was appointed to that post in January of 2018. Dr. Capuano has really a remarkable wealth and breadth of experience in energy markets and tech commercialization and energy security and resilience that she brings to this position. Prior to her appointment, she was a fellow in energy technology at the Baker Institute at the Center for Energy Studies and also a member of the faculty at Rice University. She has guided new technologies from design to successful commercialization at Marathon Oil, Selectron Flextronics, which I don't know what that means, but it's a fantastic name of a company, Selectron Flextronics, Advanced Energy Industries, Honeywell, and IBM. She is also a serial entrepreneur, having co-founded Conductus, which is a Silicon Valley startup that commercialized ceramic superconducting technology back in the 1980s. Dr. Capuano received her PhD in material science and engineering and master's at engineering from Stanford University. So we are going to have some remarks reviewing the 2019 AEO, which I believe is being released today, so we get to really make news among the 85 of you who are going to rush home to dig it into it. And then after that, we're going to have some panel discussions that allow us to move into some of the policy considerations. And so with that, let me introduce Dr. Capuano.
Oh, thank you and welcome to the official public release of the U.S. Energy Information Administration's Annual Energy Outlook 2019. I'd like to start by thanking the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting our AEO and short-term energy outlook presentations and structuring panels to discuss their implications. This is an exciting time to be modeling U.S. energy. There's a great deal of change. Over the last few years, the United States has become the largest producer of natural gas and last year the largest producer of oil in the world. Domestic production of U.S. renewable electricity is poised to overtake nuclear and then coal within the next decade. With these important changes, modeling the U.S. energy is as important as ever in 2019. The AEO is a model projection of U.S. energy systems from now until 2050. and is one of 2 long-term energy projections published to fulfill EIA's Department of Energy Organization Act of 1977 requirement that the EIA administrator prepare annual reports on trends and projections for energy use and supply. To be clear, the AEO is not a prediction. All the cases we are releasing today assume that current laws and regulations are generally unchanged to 2050. Explicitly, they do not include any proposed legislation or regulations. These cases provide a baseline that can assist in considering the impact of potential future policy options. This is especially insightful, for example, when considering timing of sunset dates. Immediately upon the conclusion of this briefing, the full AEO document, which includes these presentation graphs, as well as the full data tables for reference and side cases, will be released on the EIA website. The AEO includes, oh, where's my clicker? Okay. The AEO includes a reference case and 6 side cases with differing input assumptions to address the range of uncertainties in making long-term energy projections. For example, the reference case assumes 1.9% compound annual growth for the real U.S. growth domestic product, while the high economic growth case assumes 2.4% and the low case assumes 1.5%. The reference case assumes oil prices reach $108 per barrel in 2050, while the high oil price case assumes $211, and the low oil price case assumes $50. And the high oil and gas resource and technology case assumes more accessible resources and lower extraction technology costs when compared to the reference case, and the low case assumes fewer accessible resources and higher extraction costs when compared to the reference case. So now, before getting into the details, let's look at 5 of the important highlights of the AEO. First, the United States becomes a net energy exporter in 2020 and is projected to remain so through 2050 as a result of large production increases in crude oil, natural gas, and natural gas plant liquids, coupled with slow growth in U.S. energy consumption. The headline is that the United States produces approximately 10.9 million barrels per day of crude oil in 2018, passing the $10 million mark the 10 million barrel mark for the first time and surpassing the 1970 record of 9.6 million barrels per day. Second, U.S. natural gas production hit an all-time high of 30 trillion cubic feet in 2018, and natural gas net exports reached an all-time high of 3.3 billion cubic feet per day, and the U.S. began to export more than we import. Third, EIA projects that natural gas prices will remain comparatively low through 2050, and although electricity demand remains relatively flat, natural gas and renewable electricity generation continue to grow, with solar and wind generation capacity continuing to gain share. These graphs illustrate the high total energy production growth through 2050 on the left, and on the right, the relatively flat U.S. energy consumption at about 100 quads. These graphs also highlight that modeled energy production results are more sensitive to input assumptions than energy consumption results are. And so, the big news story is that with energy production growing and consumption relatively flat, the U.S. becomes a net energy exporter in 2020 and remains a net energy exporter in most cases. In all cases, net exports continue to grow, reach a maximum, and then around 2040 begin to decline. As you can see in this graph, the magnitude and timing of the maximum depends on the input assumptions. However, being a net exporter does not mean the United States is independent of international trade. The reference case graph on the left shows energy import and export, and the right shows the dramatic changes in import fuel mix. The crossover to net export in 2020 occurs as crude production increases and domestic consumption of petroleum products decrease. This robust two-way trade is in crude oil and refined products and indicates the U.S. is becoming a globally significant merchant refiner. The gap between the import and export widens until the 40s, when a growing U.S. economy causes domestic gasoline consumption to increase imports. Shown on the right in brown, and falling domestic crude oil production causes exports to fall. As mentioned before, the United States becomes a net natural gas exporter, the light blue line, on an annual basis, in 2017. The U.S. also continues to be a net exporter of coal and coke, the black line, but exports are not expected to increase because of competition from other global suppliers closer to major markets. Now let's look at refined products, including petroleum and other liquids. Looking at the blue dashed line on the left, we see an all-time high. The United States produced approximately 10.9 million barrels per day of crude oil in 2018. The U.S. is now the largest producer of crude oil in the world. In addition, we project that production will continue to grow as upstream producers increase output because of the combined effects of rising prices and cost reductions. Natural gas plant liquids also set a production record of 4.4 million barrels per day and continues to grow. There are a lot of uncertainties in these numbers as shown by the side cases. The size and ease of extracting the resources are represented by the green and brown resources and technology cases. There is also a lot of uncertainty around price, represented by the yellow and red oil price cases. Moving from production to consumption, the graph on the right shows that petroleum product consumption remains steady through 2050 and is in line with historical values, with variations in oil price and economic growth having more impact than the resources and technology cases. And just as we saw with total energy, the net exports of petroleum are projected to increase. With strong production growth and fairly steady domestic consumption, the U.S. becomes a net exporter of petroleum on a volume basis after 2020. Looking more closely at the reference case projection in black, the U.S. petroleum exports by volume will peak at over 3.4 million barrels per day in the mid-30s before gradually declining as domestic consumption rises. I've been alluding to the consumption increasing on the transportation energy consumption beginning around 2040, and this graph illustrates that increase. And the impact is based on current laws and regulations, and that impacts the shape of the motor gasoline consumption curve, which is the top bar in brown, in dark brown. Increases in fuel economy standards through the mid-20s reduce the total consumption of motor gasoline, and the curve declines. However, current regulations do not require additional efficiency after 2027, so the motor gasoline consumption begins to rise towards the 2050s unless further policy actions are taken. Beyond motor gasoline, jet fuel consumption in yellow continues to rise 35% to 2050 as air transportation growth outpaces increases in aircraft energy efficiency, and electricity in red also continues to increase. Now that we've looked at the liquid fuels market, let's take a look at natural gas and what happened. Okay. The graph on the left shows that natural gas production generally increases across all cases and outpaces gas consumption shown on the right. Production in the reference case in black initially grows by 7% per year, then slows to less than 1% per year after 2020. With natural gas production growth outpacing consumption growth, this has export implications that we'll show on the next slide. Looking at the left, we see the increasing U.S. gas production causes imports from Canada to decrease in pink, while exports to Canada increase in red. And by 2050, imports and exports to Canada are roughly equal. Pipeline exports to Mexico in orange increase through the mid-20s and maintain those levels through 2050 in the reference case. And looking at LNG on the right in black, exports grow as additional LNG export terminals are constructed. We also see that the level of LNG exports are significantly dependent on AEO assumptions. In the high oil price case, the yellow line, the LNG exports grow to twice that of the reference case, while the unfavorable economics of the low resource and technology case in brown shows a case where the LNG export capacity may actually become idle towards 2050. Now looking at prices. We see here that natural gas prices are influenced more by resource and technology assumptions, the brown and green lines, than global market and trade conditions, the yellow and red lines. This graph shows that Henry Hub gas prices range from $3 to $8 per BTU, depending on the input assumptions. The effect of abundant, generally low-priced natural gas is really evident in the power sector. What you see here, shown in the blue line on the left, with relatively low natural gas prices in the reference case, natural gas power generation grows steadily and remains the dominant fuel through 2050. Generation from renewable electricity sources, including hydro, the green line, grows the most, initially supported by various tax incentives that are phased out through the 20s. Renewable generation continues to grow as capital costs continue to decline. And this is important because what we're seeing now is that as the incentives roll away, there is still cost advantages, and so we see that the renewable generation does continue to gain share. The side cases show that low natural gas prices in the middle favor the growth of natural gas generation, while high natural gas prices favor renewable generation on the right, in which case the renewables are projected to become the leading source of electricity generation by 2030. Although coal in gray and nuclear in red continue to decrease in nearly all cases, they continue to play a role in electricity generation mix, but by 2020, renewable generation surpasses nuclear across all cases. These changes in power generation are accompanied by changes in capacity, and this graph, okay, this is operator error. Okay, got it. This graph shows changes in U.S. electric power capacity through 2050. From 2018 to 2021, about 70 gigawatts of combined new wind in green and solar capacity in yellow are added, driven by declining capital costs and available tax credits. After the expiration of the tax credits, new wind capacity additions continue at low levels, but as solar costs continue to decline more rapidly, the solar additions continue to grow at a more rapid rate. By the second half of the projection period, new capacity additions are split fairly evenly between solar and natural gas. Now let's consider nuclear and coal. This slide shows that nuclear capacity trends downward through the 20s before stabilizing. The level at which it stabilizes depends on economics of natural gas, as shown by the side cases, with most retirements occurring by 2025. We see a similar pattern for coal power plants, and this is reflected in the amount of coal production shown here. Coal production in the reference case is down in the west and Appalachia, but holds steady in the interior region. Now let's consider what this means to electricity prices. With all the changes in the mix of electricity generation, the graph on the left shows, if I will do this correctly, the graph on the left shows that electricity prices remain relatively stable in the reference case through 2050. Generation costs in blue decrease 16% as older, less efficient capacity is replaced by newer, more efficient capacity, including low marginal cost renewable generation. Transmission in orange and distribution costs in green increase by 18% and 25% respectively as aging infrastructure is replaced and additional capacity is added to integrate renewables into the grid. These cost changes offset each other and result in wholesale electricity price declines by 1% per year through 2050. The graph on the right shows side case price variations ranging from 9.7 to 11.6 cents per kilowatt hour. And so, to conclude this AEO discussion, let's summarize with the following two slides. The graph on the left summarizes U.S. energy production. Natural gas in blue and non-hydro renewables in green show the strongest relative growth. Liquids production in brown grows rapidly at first, plateaus, and then declines, with coal in gray and nuclear in red declining slowly. The graph on the right summarizes energy consumption by sector. The industrial consumption in green grows the fastest, taking advantage of relatively low natural gas prices, while electric power consumption in brown grows more slowly. And as we saw before, transportation energy consumption decreases as regulations require more energy-efficient vehicles. Then it increases again after standards stop escalating. And the residential and commercial building sectors maintain steady consumption as growth and demographic shifts offset efficiency gains. And so I'll restate the headline. Having passed the 10 million barrel per day mark, the United States is now the largest producer of crude oil in the world. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And we'll move to questions. Thank you. Okay. So as is our tradition for questions, we have a large number of subject matter experts from the EIA here today who will field your questions in great detail. And so I will act, actually, is Angelina, are you going to be facilitator or is Ian going to be? Okay, Angelina will facilitate the questions and direct them to the experts, so fire away.
Thank you, Dr. Capuano, for the great presentation and for all the great work that you and the team at EIA produce. What are the implications of the various cases for U.S. CO2 emissions from energy use?
So, unfortunately, the one subject matter expert of our CO2 emissions is not here. I will say, in general, CO2 emissions follow they do decline, and they do follow the mirror what the consumption in terms of sector as well as by fuel. With the increase in natural gas as well as renewables, that's where we get a continued decline. Yeah. We have more information in our flip book as well. Oh, we have a...
Hello. Okay. Bill Holland with S&P Global Market Intelligence. Maybe I misinterpreted your graph, but it appeared on the natural gas exports graph that natural gas exports went higher with a higher oil price and lower with a lower oil price.
It's the reverse.
Anyway, I was just trying to, well, what is the connection between oil prices and natural LNG exports?
Katie Dill, if you can stand up, Katie.
Hi, my name is Katie Dill. My voice projects, but I'll use the microphone as well. Imagine having an office next to me. So the reason why you saw that trend was because a lot of the growth in natural gas production is actually a function of LNG exports. And so because we do have the global price of LNG linked to oil, with that link sort of fading over time, but still that high oil price generally means that the U.S. is very competitive in the global market, and that's what drives natural gas production, whereas in the low oil price case, U.S. LNG is not competitive given the global price, and so that's why you sort of get the antithesis of what you expect. So essentially global market trends are more important than sort of natural fuel replacement or domestic fuel replacement.
Hi, Maya Weber, S&P Global Platts. On the natural gas side, I'm wondering if someone could address what, if any, significant changes in the projections going forward you see compared with last year's AEO.
Are you interested in terms of consumption or production?
Or just big picture, what big changes you see?
Do you want to talk about production, Meg?
Hi, Meg Coleman. So let's see, relative to the last AEO, the major updates for natural gas production would be sort of at the well level and reevaluating the estimated ultimate ultimate recovery per well. We did not do any major changes in the resource assessments for this AEO. So the projection, we've reevaluated drilling based on the industry, improving its efficiency in producing at the same cost as we've previously seen. So drilling efficiencies have certainly improved. We also see more natural gas production in the oil-directed drilling areas. So for example, in areas like the Permian Basin, there's a significant increase in associated natural gas production. So I think the statistic was there was something like 7% production increase in those areas in AEO 2018, whereas in 2019 it's more along the lines of 18% increase of associated gas production. So those are some of the big trends that are different this year. Having said that, it was an AEO light year, so we didn't do any major model upgrades in terms of resource assessment and that sort of information.
There's also someone.
Thank you. Thank you. Now it's Aoyama from the Asahi Shimbun, Japan's newspaper. I was wondering if some of you could comment on the geopolitical implications of the fact that the U.S. will become a net exporter by 2020 for its policy, a foreign policy.
Let's save that question for the panel. EIA presents the data, and that goes into the policy discussion. So let's defer that for the panel, which is where that should be brought up.
Okay, thank you.
There's someone in the back there that maybe you want to come forward after.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentations. Lena Kazduzian, Department of Energy. I was wondering what the level of electrification was assumed. Is that the current level of electrification in this outlook, and how that increasing of electrification in the vehicle sector and other sectors might influence some of these numbers?
You want to try vehicles first? Is John Maples here? Yeah. Oh, okay.
Start. Hi, David Stone, Transportation Sector. Sorry. So we do see increasing electrification. It's not drastically different than, say, the prior AEO, but it's driven by the usual things of declining battery costs, improving infrastructure for charging. It's still, I mean, without major policy change, it's going to be the same, but the main driver in the AEO is really from the state policies, namely the California zero-emission vehicle mandate that's adopted by 9 other states. So if more states adopt that, that's usually where we'll see the biggest gains in electric vehicles.
There's someone in the back with a question. Would you mind coming up, because it'll be hard to get to you? Thanks. Go ahead.
So on the building side for electrification, we don't have any intentional electrification built into the projections, but we do see electricity use increasing over the projections as opposed to the other fuels in buildings where we see use declining. Part of that is electricity prices over the projections. The other piece is that we do include energy efficiency incentives for equipment based on utility level rebates or state level rebates, and those tend to be directed most often towards electric using equipment.
Hi, Brian Scheid with S&P Global Platts. Last year, you talked about the crude oil production increase was largely fueled by the Permian. Was wondering if this year's report looks at all at production from places like Anwar, perhaps off the coast of the East Coast. Any policy changes there?
Meg, is Meg again? Yeah.
Yes, well, okay, so again, the major growth is in the Permian Basin, similar to last year. I would say that one of the differences this year from last year is that the near-term prices were higher than what we assumed last year, and so the baseline is sort of higher. So the pattern is similar, but you know, there is more production growth even in this year's AEO due to the increasing production in the Permian, where most of the growth is. In terms of ANWR, we did. Let's see. That was also, let's see, that was 2018 where we, evaluated ANWR. So ANWR, we don't really see that hasn't changed since last year. So given the timeline of permitting and exploration and development in the Arctic, since there haven't been any wells drilled yet, that hasn't changed. We still, in the reference case, given those assumptions that we have in the reference case, don't have any production coming online until 2030 or 2031, I think it is. And let's see, what was your other question? ANWR and East Coast. Yeah, I don't believe our assumptions have changed since the 2018 AEO. Yeah, they haven't, so.
Good morning, Dr. Capuano. John Bird with National Society of Professional Surveyors and the U.S. Geo group. We run the 3DEP coalition. So my comment is you all use a great amount of maps, GIS, and geospatial data on your website to project exactly the visualization opportunities on these kind of efforts. For this kind of outlook and kind of what kind of opportunity did you get to leverage with USGS? They have a program called the 3D Elevation Program, and Dr. Riley and his capable staff highlight transmission, distribution, pipeline safety opportunities through the use of LiDAR technology. Can you comment on how much?
I can comment. We actively interact with the USGS. I don't know if there's one of the experts that wants to talk about more detail, but we actively team with other agencies to get at their data and share data. And the process of creating an annual energy outlook for the United States and our international energy outlook is a series of workshops where we bring in experts and we share data. Again, we're open and transparent, so these workshops are a very open sharing of information to get opinions, to get their insights on the trends that we think are shaping up. And so while I personally can't answer specifically about that data, I can assure you that we do bring that into the discussion. Does any one of the experts want to make a comment? Okay, that's sufficient? Okay. We have one, we'll take one more question before we move into the panel. Yeah.
Is this on? Okay, here we are. Thank you, Dr. Capuano. Gavin Bade with Utility Dive. I had a question for the team about your coal projections out to 2050. You see coal continuing to retire for the next few years, if I'm reading it correctly, but then it kind of flatlines, and it's still in 2050 is a sizable portion of U.S. generation. I wonder how you guys came up with it, and if you think that any of the deregulatory efforts over the past year, specifically around new source review and the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, had an impact on that projection for coal.
Greg Adams, EIA. In answer to the second part of the question, we haven't included the Affordable Clean Energy Act or new source review changes in our projections in this AEO yet, so that's not included yet. Looking forward, we do have fixed O&M adders to incorporate the cost of keeping aging plants alive. Natural gas prices recover sufficiently by 2030 to cover the economics of that, and so we keep them online through that time frame because they can be maintained over time. So unless there's a specific policy or other changes that would force them to close, we're going to keep them online.
Yeah, so to be crisp about it, our models are really economic models, so they really are, and policies can affect the economics, obviously trump that. And so what you're seeing is that kind of a roll-off is economically competitive question. Yeah. Okay.
On the economics point, I was wondering about the economics of renewable energy. Utilities increasingly saying that wind and solar can be cheaper than their existing.
Yeah, so the question you're asking, because you don't have a mic, I think is, yes, is is the economics of others like solar and wind being taken into account? The answer is yes. These models really do look at the impacts of one form on another. And again, you can go in, as you download the data, take a look at it, you'll see that. But we do that. Anyone want to disagree or agree emphatically with me? Okay.
I'll just add that in the near term, the economics are certainly being influenced by the available tax credits, which phase out over the next couple of years. But even in the long term, if you go back to the capacity addition slide that Dr. Capuano showed, basically for the next 20 or so years, there are only two types of capacity that we show being built. One of them is solar and one of them is natural gas. And certainly we're recognizing that, and a little bit of wind in there as well, that, the renewables are
You're talking about
on the margin very economic for new capacity.
I just put it up on the screen. You see the range of the cases. We do show a case where there's considerably more growth of renewables because its economics are better. I will also point out, as long as we're talking about economics, I mean, consumption plays a big part. And so if there is not generation available from one source, it'll have to come from another. So that's also in this kind of a mix. So as it's coming on, it can displace less competitive generation, but it has to come online before it can do that. Okay.
Does the mix of utility solar versus small-scale distributed solar change in any of these projections?
Go ahead, answer again, and then we'll move to the panel.
Generally, what we see is the amount of solar total is within any given projection, saying that the model trades off a lot between distributed and utility scale solar. So if there are incentives or market factors that cause utility to go up, we'll get a little bit less at the end use level and vice versa. But within any given projection, the solar balance remains the same.
So with that, we're going to move into the panel. And continue to be able, continue to be able to field questions. Again, I think as you see, there is a driving interest in policy and the impact of things. And again, I point out that we provide data and do not get engaged in those discussions because we want to be an unbiased, independent provider of the data that can be used. And so we know with knowing that interest, we want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for setting up these panels, which will allow you to ask people their insights and opinions on what our projections imply. And so things like market policy and technology forces driving the AEO projections of U.S. fuel consumption and generation, the development of tight and shale resources, impact of sustained low natural gas prices and falling renewables cost, and a lot of the questions around the uncertainties that could impact these projections. So as you were asking about electricity sector trends, consumption trends of oil and petroleum production, and impact of emerging technologies across sectors. So I just thank you, Jason, for hosting the panel.
Thank you very much, Administrator, and to the entire EIA team. I think it's really tremendous that the agency is so interested in kind of transitioning quickly to this policy discussion, and we have a terrific panel to help us do that. If you would come on up. So both the Administrator and I think, made the same essential comment, which is that it is terrific to be able to now have a policy debate based on real detailed evidence. It is terrific to have a panel with the expertise and self-confidence to have that discussion, having not yet had a chance to actually read the study. But I do believe that there is enough knowledge, and the presentation was detailed enough that we can really get into this. So let me introduce our panelists. To my immediate left, the Honorable Colette Honorable. I love saying that. Colette was a commissioner at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission from 2014 to 2017. I'd like to note that she was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate, one of probably the last moments of that kind of camaraderie that we can look back upon. Prior to her time at FERC, she was the chairman of the Arkansas Public Service Commission, past president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. She was chief of staff to the Arkansas Attorney General and a member of the governor's cabinet, and is currently a partner at the law firm Reed Smith. I'm also proud to say that Colette is a senior fellow here at the BPC, and if I could just also share one more insight, she has a remarkable ability to make people feel good while not giving them what they want, which I think is a skill that I seek to learn. Following Colette, Kevin Book. Kevin is the managing director and co-founder of Clearview Energy Partners, where he heads the research team and covers oil, natural gas, refined products, and coal policy. Kevin is one of those folks with the breadth and credibility that when almost we ever have an energy panel, someone says like, well, what about Kevin? And we are able to, he's a recidivist. He comes back from time to time, which we appreciate. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, National Petroleum Council, has an affiliation with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And prior to co-founding Clearview, Kevin worked as a senior analyst for a national investment bank. He has an MA in Law and Diplomacy degree from Fletcher and a BA in Economics from Tufts. And third, Arshad Mansoor. Arshad is the Senior Vice President of Research and Development at the Electric Power Research Institute. He's responsible for an incredibly broad portfolio of R&D and demonstration programs spanning all sources of generation and power delivery, utilization, and in the environment. He holds 5 U.S. patents in power electronics and distributed energy resources. Arshad earned a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology and a PhD in Electrical Engineering from UT Austin. When we reached out to a bunch of friends and family and said, we have to have somebody in this panel who can really help us think about disruptive technologies and kind of really look into that future, we got about 4 emails immediately saying, have you invited Dr. Mansoor? And so we did. Finally, the administrator, while she has assiduously noted that she cannot get involved in aggressive policy conversations, has offered to stay on the panel with us as a resource, and I expect we're going to try to lure her into territory that she hopes to avoid. So to kick it off, just as a very general kind of insight, I read this as saying gas, gas, gas. Low natural gas prices are going to create a situation where economics, policy, technology progression are going to bring us to a world where the electricity system is basically gas and some renewables, which kind of go flat, and coal and nuclear are going to kind of hang on with some optimistic policy expectations, but we will have an electric sector that is dominated by gas with some renewables. My question to all of you is that okay? And as it is the first question, I also invite you to say anything that you plan to say, just regardless of what I was going to ask you. And we'll just kind of go down the list, and then we'll focus on electricity, do a little discussion on oil and gas, and have time for questions.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Jason and team, the folks behind the curtain, for pulling together this great positive morning on a dreary day, hence my pink attire to try to bring a little.
Appreciate it.
And thank you, Dr. Capuano, and your team for your hard work. I didn't find surprises in this outlook, but confirmations. And one is the strength and the importance of fuel and resource diversity. I have no problem whatsoever with gas trending the way that it does. From a policy perspective and a former regulatory background. And in fact, given the very strong onslaught of renewables that we will see, we need that gas. So that's very encouraging for me. And a few other trends that I thought were very positive in the energy mix. Clearly, speaking of renewables specifically, the fact that solar is such a big part of that is really encouraging because it speaks to what is occurring behind that, that the administrator so delicately didn't want to address. I will. What we see are really strong state policies and great efforts by not only utility regulators, industry, So men and women around boardrooms around the country who are focused on integrating renewables, integrating advanced technologies, and aligning with state policy in a way to bring this about. This doesn't just happen overnight. It's not magic. So that's really positive for me. Another trend that I thought was extremely promising was the transportation sector increased fuel economy. Those of us energy geeks know we really need to focus on that sector, and to see those numbers bear out really says that the efforts of many are bearing fruit. So stay encouraged, despite the fact that we're in DC on a dreary day. The last thing I will note is the important continuing trend of our collective focus on energy efficiency, right? The kilowatt hour that's never used, which is key, not only for balancing the mix, but ensuring sustainability. So I'm really encouraged to see that, in particular given the work that EPRI does. For instance, the Energy Futures Initiative has been really focused on the prominent role that energy efficiency will play, and so I'm really heartened by the outlook and find it to be quite positive.
As I expected, your optimism is infectious and encouraging. Kevin, I find you sometimes to be a less optimistic person.
Well, I intend to support that for you. Yeah. Let me thank you first, Jason, for setting low expectations that I can now exceed, and also for putting on a terrific event. Dr. Capuano, for another wonderful outlook, bravely looking into the distant future. I will tell you right now that our firm does not have that kind of courage. Analytically, we're only comfortable with about 18 months, and even then, we're getting a little shaky in the knees. It takes a lot to look that far ahead, and it's an essential tool for understanding and for really having the kind of discussion that we're going to have. Before we get to that question about is gas okay, I mean, you know, that's kind of a bait question. I'm going to take your option to say something else entirely, and to really talk a little bit about what the role of policy is and how fundamentally it can subvert expectations, like the very good data-backed predictions we just saw. And in 9 words, I can teach you all how to be wrong about the energy future. It's got 3 parts. Significant government control, part 1. 2, limited data quality, and let me be very clear, not EIA. They are part of the solution, not the problem. It's just that energy is big and the data are hard. And 3, long infrastructure life. Those 9 words can make a lifetime of error. And I'm probably about halfway through my career making those mistakes myself, so now I give them to you. On the government control part, and that's really where I think the role of policy is so prominent, what we have is a policy apparatus here in the United States configured for scarcity, which has yet to properly transition into a new world. And the reason is that U.S. energy policy tends to be reactive to things that go wrong. And the reason it only reacts to things that go wrong is that it's hard to forge policy in a regionally fragmented resource base. And as a result, regulators have to reinterpret old laws for new circumstances, which sends things to courts that review them and very frequently create uncertainty about investment in the long haul. To address that future, that policy that was designed to address scarcity is going to have to pivot and accommodate the opportunity set that EIA has referred to in some of those high cases, those high resource cases, those high technology cases. And so I think that very much the question we should be having is not so much, you know, is energy over because we've now got enough? There's a tendency for complacency, but the lines that converge back towards energy liquids neutrality in 2050 are probably reasons for humility. We may not be energy independent forever, but rather how do we maximize the value in the near term? As we pivot to this new export-focused energy future, how is government policy going to support that and accommodate many of the competing and very thorny discussions involving externalities? Now to gas. Gas because oil, in part, too. Right? One of the takeaways from that presentation is that role of gas is decidedly linked to the abundance of crude that will come out in the right market and policy circumstances because it's associated gas. And also high prices in the world mean that when we think about what we want out of energy here in the United States, low pump prices may be starting to lose their economic appeal as an export-focused producer nation needs more out of the ground and into the world to produce that greener, cleaner, gas-based mix. So I think that wasn't entirely negative, Jason. I hope I didn't disappoint.
I'm actually pleasantly surprised. So, Dr. Mansoor, you know, I set you up as being the technology guru, which I think is fair. But how would you bring your perspective to this broad question?
Thank you, Kevin. Well, let me first start. My team gives a shout out to the EIA team. We have a modeling team, and there's a lot of similarity, especially on the supply side. But it's a difficult task. It's not a prediction, and I'm going to quote a famous philosopher. It's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And while this is not a prediction, what EIA does, and we look at analysis from all over the world, different nations, EIA, and it is the most fundamentally sound basis. It's not a prediction. It's based on where technology is going. So it's an asset not just to the nation, but anybody who's doing energy analysis. Going back to the technology side, and I'll ask all of you to do some PhD thesis research. Just Google U.S. National Electrification Assessment, USNEA. That was a report that was released last year. And if we look at the supply side, we're actually pretty same thinking, and some of the data actually came from EIA. But where we look into the future from a technology perspective, and I can bucket it into really two main areas. One is the demand side of the equation. It's customer choice, comfort, control, cost that will drive the type of energy use and the way we use it. And if we are sitting here 10 years ago, I don't think we would be able to see where shale is here today. If you look at 2030, I think we are underestimating where transportation and electricity sector, how they will be intertwined. I'll just give you a couple of data points, and recent data points, 2-3 years. We've been talking about EVs are happening for the last 20 years. It really hasn't happened. When you have 1% electricity cell as EV, you don't call it happening. Tough to figure out inflection points. And when we say innovation, it's not a science-driven innovation inflection point. It's a technology, engineering-driven inflection point. Battery cost $800 a kilowatt hour just 7-8 years ago. Now you're looking at 150, 100. There is every reason to think engineering innovation could lead to $50 a kilowatt hour. What does that mean? You're driving a 300-mile car with 70 kilowatt hour battery. A 70 kilowatt hour of battery, if each kilowatt hour was $800, do your own multiplication. It could be $50, and do the multiplication. And look at the cost side. You showed the chart of what 2050 electricity price could look like and what 2050 crude oil price could look like. Do your own math and see how much does a customer save in terms of its energy bill. So if you go back to the U.S. National Electrification Assessment, USNEA, by the way, we'll be happy to answer, the modelers will be happy to answer any questions that you may have later on. We see a future, a very, very positive future. We see a future where our GDP grows. The data comes from EIA. We are not forecaster of GDP. But we do that in a much more efficient way. So actually, our energy consumption internally, domestically, goes down. But great opportunity to export, as you just saw, we will be an energy exporter. But we do that with a lower cost to customers. It seems like too good to be true, but that's really what electrification provides to customers. And the electrification of transportation, we had 5 EV models that was available in 2017. We will have more than 100 EV models that have been publicly announced by 2022. That's the type of inflection we are looking at. But overall, I think it's the results of the 2019, the outlook are not that different from where we are, except on the demand side, how customers use energy.
Dr. Capuano, anything you want to clarify in this conversation?
I will make a few comments. I think when you initially asked the question about becoming reliant on, let's say, natural gas and renewables, You know, this is a very traditional question about should we be single sourced. I mean, I also teach operations strategy at the Jones School at Rice University before I came here. And the manufacturing industry has dealt with those issues for the last few decades of going from, when I first started working at IBM, we had multiple sources in order to be sure there weren't going to be disruptions. And now, fast forward, in order to be competitive, you have to have just-in-time inventory, just-in-time manufacturing. And they've dealt with how do you respond if there's a shock or something in your system when you're so sole sourced. And so there are lessons to be learned there, and I know there are many people that are dealing with that. But there's also a challenge to modeling. I think people need to understand that while we can look, people do look at how things respond in a shock situation when a supply line is disruptive, one of the problems with the modeling that we do in many models is that they have perfect forward vision. And so one of the first things I did when I came into EIA was I asked, what happens if we put a disruption into the models? And unfortunately, the models will see that coming, and they adjust for it. And so so this is now a challenge. What we need are models that can do this long range, but also accommodate a shock, so we can see how things adjust. Right now, the models are not able to do that.
So I want to pick up a couple of these points and ask another question to the whole, and we'll get a little more specific. And it's really about the pace of innovation. Anyone who's reading the IPCC study or looking broadly at the challenges around climate and resilience will say we need tremendous amounts of innovation. We do not have the technologies today to address these issues consistent with global economic needs. I don't see innovation happening fast enough. And based on these charts, I think they present an incredibly effective, happy world as long as we didn't actually have what we perceive to be existential threats from resilience or climate change. And so going back to this wondrous low gas price environment, do you agree with that perception? And if not, what does that suggest for policy, since we're not going to dictate economics in this country? Do we have a policy environment that can address those big problems? And Kevin's cringing, so I'm going to go to him first, and then we're going to bounce around a little bit.
So I'm pessimistic and also prone to cringing, just for the record. Jason, I would offer two generalizations. The first is that when it comes to innovation, I think incremental change tends to surprise to the upside. I think we're often amazed by how fast things happen. How long ago were we talking about energy independence in the 2025 timeframe? And now it's next year. And so the diffusion and propagation of technologies that mature and scale throughout the networks that are in place today often really amazes us how quickly things get out there. What tends to surprise to the downside is revolutionary change. So if the evolutions are faster than we expect, the revolutions, the solid-state batteries, the nuclear fusion, the cellulosic ethanol that can use any source, they're kind of 6 years away forever. And that tendency locks us into a technology subset and a solution set that is less the stuff of dreams and more the question of how you address what you've got to different challenges, whether they're economic or climate-based. And so I'm not sure that that's necessarily good or bad, but what it means is that solving those economic and environmental problems requires new and creative ways to work with what you've got. And the good news is that the incremental evolutionary change will probably come very quickly to the rescue when some of those technologies diffuse. When we get to battery costs of $50 per kilowatt hour, there's not going to be that many questions about whether transportation incentives will be necessary at a state level. The IRR model that we have blows through the x-axis and goes straight off the page. By 2040, you're not going to want to buy an ICE EV under a certain set of assumptions. But in terms of the revolutionary change, I think policy shouldn't bet on it. I think it's a dangerous move. I think policymakers who've done so in the past have been disappointed. So that was my question.
Arshad, to dig in on EVs, right, because they're a very kind of understandable, prominent discussion, have been for a while, 100, 120 models. I'm a little colorblind, but when I looked at the uptick of EVs in the reference case, It was not revolutionary. It was hard to see.
and that's
where's the disconnect here?
So I'll make somewhat repeat my comments from before. So I'll make two observations. One is, again, as you saw in my background, I have a very strong technology background. And what I find very interesting is that technology, meaning economists, turns into incremental change, meaning engineering invention, optimizing what you already know. And so we are moving rapidly into a more integrated world. And so being able to integrate technology and the timing, or let's say modeling timing, of radical innovation and with the incremental would be beneficial. But again, the models aren't really set up to handle a breakthrough innovation. They really can only handle incremental. So our model is that way. We, with lack of foresight as to what radically might happen in technology, we have incremental optimization change. And I'm looking around at my experts. Did I portray that correctly? Okay, nods. Okay.
So Arshad, promising you that no one will ever remember what you're about to say. Known unknowns, right? So I mean, if the AEO was a high school yearbook, right? What is most likely to disrupt? What's your?
Well, so let me again answer this question more academically, which is, as a technologist, we think in terms of scientific breakthroughs being 70-year breakthroughs or 50-year breakthroughs, that kind of order. So, for example, the high-temperature superconductors that were discovered in the 80s would have been a 75-year breakthrough. An engineering breakthrough might be happening every 5 years because that's an optimization. So there are ways to look at that. So while not being able to predict a specific invention, you could say that something surprising will enter into batteries or into the EVs every 70 years.
So, Arshad, I don't got 70 years. What?
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying.
So
go ahead.
No, the memorable quote, you will remember if I say that Saints will play again. They'll get another shot. So just keep that in mind. Remember that.
Super Bowl?
So I think we are completely not understanding what innovation means in terms of adoption rate. PV, has there been innovation in PV? Yes, no? Photovoltaic, solar? Yeah. In 1950, AT&T had the first PV panel, basically the same technology that we are using today. In 1950, the cost of that PV panel, I don't know, Google it out, maybe $500 per kilowatt. It's 50 cents per kilowatt today. So engineering innovation driven by volume of production, lowering cost, drives adoption. That's one. Second, it's hard. Another hard to predict. How do you predict customer behavior? Who would have predicted that with a laptop and an iPhone, I also need an iPad? Guess how many iPads have been sold or tablets have been sold? You go and look at customer behavior of the 1% customer that have bought an EV and ask them, will they go back to an ICE engine car? Not because of cost, they will not. Most of them will stay with EV because it's a customer experience that you're getting. And I think it's hard to predict that in a model, and that's why you don't see the EV sliver is so small. But if you just step back and look at what electrification will afford, not just to electric transportation, but to other sectors, even to industrial sectors, then you will see it will be driven by customer choice, comfort, control, cost, and their desire to have clean energy. And we are a firm believer at the end of the day, customers decide what they want for their purpose. And it could be driven by cost, could be driven by clean, could be driven by reliability.
And I'd like to emphasize one of the points that you put in, because before I'm quoted that we have to wait for 70 years. The fact is that multiple engineering inventions and optimizations can really take a lot of ground, and those happen very frequently. And so you don't have to wait for the 70-year invention. And in fact, that's what you were skillfully explaining. And that's why we're seeing EVs take as much ground as they have. Again, it's are we half full or half empty? What you're seeing, as we were showing in the AEO, is that policies, even as policies roll away, things continue to grow, which means that they work has been done to make them economically competitive. If we want them to grow faster, certainly things can be done to make them better investments in technology. Other things can be done to make it grow faster, but it's working, and so I don't look at it pessimistically.
So, Colette, I want to draw you into the policy discussion, but you can obviously go because I believe you are constructively impatient, and you talked about the role of the states. I mean, obviously, we have a lot of imagination about what the federal government might do, but in electricity, the collision, the graceful collision there is wholesale market design. And, I think very few people outside of this room really understand FERC's role in how one can design the boundary conditions that accelerate these ideas. How do you think about that? Do you think wholesale market design is inevitable, and how important would it be?
Sure. And if I could take
of course you can.
A minute or two to respond to the earlier question, because I think to answer the earlier question, yes, there are lags in technological innovation, but in part it's due to the need for greater certainty with regard to policy and the proper amount of regulation. And in a couple of areas we've seen that. It's a symbiotic relationship. Take energy storage, for example. I can't say that policy development and regulation cause prices to go down significantly, but I can say without hesitation that policy development and the proper amount of regulation in wholesale markets have removed barriers for the integration of energy storage resources in wholesale markets. That's unequivocal. Another example of innovation with the proper amount of regulation, and less so, is the development of non-conventional gas resources, which has, I would suggest, unilaterally changed the shape of our mix nationally and our position globally. And it was the proper amount of regulation. That doesn't mean no regulation. It means the proper amount that allows the market to control what occurs. And through the advancement of technology, the ability to produce more economically increased. So it's a chicken and egg issue. I also say we can walk and chew gum at the same time. While we're focused on fuel and resource diversity, that enables us to focus inherently on reliability, the everyday job of keeping the lights on, as well as resilience, preparing for threats to energy delivery, and then being able to rebound from that, including cyber events, severe weather events, impacts of climate change. So now to get to the question you just posed, clearly there's an important role in wholesale market design here that is not static. And I will also admit that it is not graceful at times. And going to FERC at the time that I did really allowed me to come informed about the roles that states play. Yes, in overseeing what's happening at the retail and distribution level. Also juggling what's happening at the executive branches and in legislatures across the country, where you have states, yes, like California and New York, but guess what? Like Illinois and Ohio and Texas and other places, which are so much more active in shaping their own energy futures. Now, that collision, which is absolutely not graceful, with FERC's operation of wholesale energy markets and its role to ensure that the markets operate as intended without undue or preferential treatment for a particular source or a particular governor or state, quite frankly, and therein lies the problem. So the trends that the administrator set forward really heighten the focus on our need to resolve some of the wholesale market issues. Are we okay with the fact that we're going to continue to have nuclear retirements? Some of us aren't. It's a challenge, but I suggest to you that it's a very difficult one that will take some time to wade through. Wading through it in a way that does not pick winners and losers. Regulators do not have the ability to say, we want to save coal and nuclear. But regulators have a duty to make sure that markets are operating fairly, operating as intended, and where all sources and resources have an opportunity to compete.
So one more electricity question before getting into petroleum. There's a growing movement towards zero versus renewable when it comes to the kind of standard setting that I think you're suggesting. But it certainly has not been the history, right? The embedded structure of clean energy mandates is very much kind of a renewables base. You brought up nuclear. We're seeing some states that are starting to essentially kind of create that zero obligation, which rewards both nuclear and renewables and storage and everything else. How do you see the renewables versus zero conversation, and do you think it's an important one?
I absolutely do. And honestly, I have to applaud those states that are taking the chance on nuclear because of its attributes and because of the way that the energy mix will continue to be shaped. We need nuclear too. For a number of reasons, for reliability, resilience. I come from Arkansas where we had 2 units, never a problem unless there was a planned maintenance outage. And it was an important part of our energy mix, particularly in a state with the lower per capita income. So when I think about our collective energy aspirations, traditionally we've thought about, of course, reliable, affordable, safe. Now we consistently see sustainable cropping into the mix, and that's important for our long-term energy sustainability, and nuclear, therefore, will be a part of that. So I support those efforts and applaud those states because, yes, it's risky. Likewise, our other investments, and we're seeing how that's playing out across the country in other areas. But for those states that are working with what they have to meet their goals, I applaud them and we should support them.
So someone I think in the front row asked the question to the administrator about some of the geopolitical implications of growing domestic production and some of the inherent uncertainty in those global markets. Kevin, do you want to reflect a little bit on just broadly how you interpret the petroleum projections and what we should, what are the very predictable black swans that we might be wanting to think about?
I'll put my black helicopter on the launch pad and put on my tinfoil hat, Jason, and get right down to it. Hydrocarbon fuels are part of everyone's long-term projection, and the notion that there is at some point some plateau and decline is gained a lot of traction, but it's a bit early, I think, to be talking about peak demand when you have 1 million plus, 1.25 million, 1.4 barrels per day of liquids growth each year. So the question of supply and who gives it to the world and at what price on what terms is also really not changed very much in the global picture, because you still have demand stressing a supply system that is declining out from under us and inventories that are expensive to maintain that get depleted when times of scarcity show up. What is different about the U.S. posture is that we do have the opportunity to intervene with not necessarily our oil exports or our products exports, which we've been a net exporter of refined products since 2011. So the first freedom ships of energy were sailing almost a decade ago. But really the opportunity for LNG to be disruptive in a land-based distribution network is very different from our liquids, which were always going to be seaborne. That's how most 60% or so of the crude that travels is moving on ships. So that kind of opportunity set, I think, has gotten a lot of attention because, particularly in Washington, after 4 decades of feeling very, very weak and poor, we suddenly feel very powerful and very strong. But we have select opportunities because most of those opportunities are also mediated by markets. We don't have a state-owned natural gas company here in America, and a lot of our counterparties for trade are constrained by the fact that market forces and private ownership also make economic and not political choices. But it is something. And to overlook its meaning to countries that think of energy existentially, and very much those in the former Soviet Union's orbit, like Poland, those kinds of choices are extremely important. And so I think that it would be wrong to say that we are sending out our flotilla of freedom ships and America's going to set all the energy captives free. But it would also be wrong to discount the effect that we're having. We are changing the world one molecule at a time.
If I could add to that, I agree with Kevin completely, and to the gentleman from the Japan press entity that asked the question. This past year, I led a roundtable for regulators focused on LNG, and I was astounded by the interest of regulatory colleagues all over the world. It was held at the World Forum on Energy Regulation in Mexico. And there were very engaged, curious, interested regulators from Asia, from South America, of course, Mexico, Europe. They envy our infrastructure. It's second to none. And our ability, to Kevin's point, not only to produce but move it where it needs to go. Yes, within the constraints of the market. So at the same time where the U.S. in this 10-year time frame that he references has moved to now a position of strength in the world market, becoming energy independent, we are also helping our neighbors in very tough geopolitical situations around the world where there are very political decisions being made around energy transport. And so while we may not be the one to set everyone free, I think there are a number of places around the globe that are very interested in the U.S.'s new standing in the global gas market and very interested to engage.
So, Arshad, I wanted to come back on this question of electrification. EPRI is spending a lot of time really thinking about what those inflection points might look like. Kevin made the point a few times that we do have this long-lived trillions of dollars of infrastructure that is eager to stay in the game as long as it can. Are there policy ideas that you think are important to enable that kind of electrification, or do you think the consumer preference that you described will be enough to just drive the economics towards greater market share?
I'll start with the caveat. We don't influence policy. We inform policy with our science and technology. Before I answer that question, quick, what Colette mentioned, it's engineering innovation in the energy sector initially is actually driven by policy, enabling policy and regulation. If you look at PV, if you look at other innovation, the engineering side, it happens because volume goes up. Initially, volume will not go up just because customer wants it, because cost doesn't come down. It's a perfect chicken and egg situation. So enabling policy and regulation is actually instrumental on engineering innovation, and we have seen that in spades across different sectors of energy. So when we look at electrification, we talk about technology, customer choice, but if you look at our report, it does talk about enabling policy and regulations. A good example of enabling policy and regulation. How do you define energy efficiency? We spend $7 billion in US today to incentivize customers to adopt more efficient LED light bulbs and more efficient homes. That $7 billion is spent from customers, ratepayers' money through electric utilities. And it is driving efficiency, but it's focused only on electricity. So if I change a light bulb to an LED light bulb, that's energy efficiency. If I take my car and buy an EV, is that energy efficiency? In the full scale of energy efficiency, that's 1/3 more efficient from a BTU perspective. So energy efficiency needs to be fuel neutral. So when we look at that, we envision a absolutely positive future where our GDP will grow, but reduced energy consumption. It doesn't mean electricity or natural gas or oil, it means all of them. So I think one of the key enabling policy that we point out is the concept of let energy efficiency, which has been so great for the country over the last 30 years. We're becoming more efficient every day, every year. Just look at the GDP and decoupling of energy. And it will continue even more. And at the end, if you do that, who wins? And then the customer wins. Yes. Because using less energy for whether you're driving a car or heating a home or lighting your house.
So I have one more question, then we're going to open it up for about 20 minutes of discussion. And again, it's really coming back to this question of kind of scale and pace. None of us are climate scientists, but the center of gravity in that community is suggesting that the U.S. and other very developed countries need to be virtually decarbonized around mid-century. And let's just say virtually and around. when I looked at those charts, none of the cases seemed to be moving in anywhere close to that direction. And am I misreading that, or is it fair to conclude that best predictions of current economics, technology penetration, and current policy are not getting us close to what the science suggests? Is that a fair conclusion from what we just witnessed?
You're asking me? Yeah, I'm struggling with how to respond. What the models show, what the models show.
I was trying to put enough ifs in there to make it.
Yeah, I understand. And I mean, while economics, clearly they're economic models, policy obviously affects that, and we're seeing policy is being successful in accomplishing many things. What I don't believe that you can draw just from the graphs that you saw is what's the total systems impact, which is what I think you're asking. We will, when you download it, you will see there is a CO2 slide, but CO2 is only one element in the environment. I mean, we have a responsibility to the whole environment and not just CO2. And so the AEO question was not that question. The AEO question is really to understand consumption and production, what supply and demand in energy, and because that is what our charge is. And so the derivative question of the impacts on the economy, while we will provide data that will help people analyze that, we're not really drawing a conclusion on that. Is that does anyone in EIA want to add to that? Okay.
So I'm delighted you responded. I actually wasn't expecting you would even try, so thank you, because that's not easy. To those of you who are unencumbered, have no constituents, and can just speak from your depths of experience.
Unbought and unbossed.
Every election you kind of have this question, right track, wrong track. And there's a lot of detail up there, but I'm just trying to kind of distill where we think we are. I'll just acknowledge, the Bipartisan Policy Center believes we need a much broader suite of technologies than what's out there, and that we should be spending a lot of money trying to figure out how to get there, because we interpret that we are not yet on a right track. And I guess if anyone thinks that that's just missing the moment, I would love the opportunity to understand why.
Could I jump in and say, I think that perspective looks like if we look outside today, it's a little overcast.
It is.
But when I look at those slides going back to my earlier comments, I see that we're moving in the right direction. Mm-hmm. We are absolutely moving in the right direction with integrating more renewables. The transportation sector is becoming more economic, which is actually the largest sector of energy intensity. That's extremely promising for me. The most carbon intensive areas are trending down. Mm-hmm. Gas is coming up, as we expected. Mm-hmm. Even under the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan, we weren't going to get to zero by 2032. So I am really encouraged by these numbers because it tells us we're headed in the right direction. We absolutely have more work to do, which guess what means job security for all of us. So with that glass half full approach, I'll yield to my colleagues.
Well, now I can finally be pessimistic.
Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Colette.
I've been working on this.
No, it was a great setup because look, every economist in the world loves to talk about price signals, and no politician really wants to send one. And what's missing is the price signal that motivates the behavior change.
I agree, 110%.
And everyone who wants to do that gets to be a one-term whatever they are. So the challenge, and look, you don't need the gilets jaunes or the reactions to carbon tax discussions as evidence. The real issues are that the social motivation to put this first. We would have a climate law today, except the Obama administration spent a lot of political capital on Obamacare. And society, I think, and perhaps a lot of the constituents that were being served by the Congress and by the administration at that time, wanted that first. When society decides it wants this, the challenges are going to be how to do it. And so what's very interesting, Jason, is that the discussion seems to be very different than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was about how to send the price signal, should it be cap and trade, and how should it look. And for the last several years in Washington, people have been talking about market-based carbon tax signals that would motivate similar behavior change. But there's a new rising generation of progressives who are suggesting that maybe that's not fast enough. And what they want are non-market interventions. And what they want are prescriptive standards, and in some cases, phase-outs or bans, things that create real thorny problems in a capitalist, market-based economy. And yet, that perspective seems to be growing stronger. And with regard to the division you mentioned a moment ago about the pure green, non-hydro renewables movement and the clean, that pragmatic choice may also reflect that the green jobs that came with renewables are starting to abate with a greater deployment and manufacturing efficiency of renewable technologies. Sure. Also, unemployment is really low. So now, talking about how to solve a climate problem may be rising to the top of the debate, and how to solve the immediate economic challenges of the Great Recession are receding. And so that may explain the change, but these two things don't necessarily dovetail into the solution set I think that you're talking about. Right now, the political debate seems to be diverging from new willingness to discuss market-based protocols and a new telegraphed urgency to retire existing infrastructure ahead of its depreciation schedule.
All right, we now have about 20 minutes for conversation. I hope I've relieved you all of the obligation of asking lots of climate questions, but you're, of course, entitled to follow your hopes. Please tell us who you are. We have mic runners. They're running a lot today. Why don't we go right to the middle back, just to make it incredibly challenging.
Sure. I think I can talk about it now. I'm Kate.
No, you need the microphone.
I'm from the Department of Energy. You mentioned infrastructure just very briefly, and I'm curious what kind of impact, either in the existing model or just kind of more broadly, you think the pipelines and potential like coal terminal in Washington State, those types of investments and their completion, what kind of impact does that have in the like forward-looking projection of use and cost?
Is that an AEO question, or are you looking for speculation?
This is a democracy. Anybody who wants to...
I'd like to hear both, yeah.
Does someone at EIA?
I'll jump in from a regulator.
Why don't you jump in while the mic moves over to EIA, and we'll...
From a former regulator's perspective, infrastructure is key. We will not be able to move renewables where they need to go. We won't be able to move the gas where it needs to go if we don't have that necessary infrastructure, which, by the way, takes years and too long, I might say, to bring about. And so I'm glad you mentioned that one word that is integral to making sure that we stay on track with important and positive trends in our aspirations of what the energy future needs to look like. We absolutely can't do it without that necessary infrastructure. So that requires a great amount of work at the federal level in organized regional organizations, independent system operators, regional transmission organizations, and coordination with our very important state colleagues who are making significant retail and distribution level infrastructure decisions all across the country. Somehow that has to meet up. And so that work and focus on infrastructure will be key. And without it, we absolutely won't realize the trends I would suggest that the AEO outlook bears out.
Any additional input?
Yeah, so I'm Katie Dill again from EIA. I'm the natural gas modeler. And I think to address your question, the way the model works is that we put an additional cost on building new infrastructure, but essentially determine that if the market needs it, it'll build it. And so, sort of getting back to one of the points that our administrator made about perfect foresight, right? It's essentially saying, given the perfect foresight, we need this infrastructure, for example, from the Northeast, Marcellus, Utica, down to the Gulf Coast where there's the petrochemical plants and the LNG terminals, in order to, again, bear out what the outlook provides. So we don't take into account delays or, we just assume it gets built, and so we then leave it to the policy people to determine if that's a, how to facilitate that or not.
Yeah, then I'll add something, because here we're talking about the long term. We also have, and we're going to hear from our short-term energy outlook, with that assumption that it comes, that infrastructure arrives when it's needed. If, as we month to month are looking at data and we find that something is not happening, it shows up in our short-term energy outlook. So that's how you can correct as you find, if you see that there are delays to things that are being expected.
Thank you for saying that, Administrator, because I think I'm sitting too close to Kevin now, because now I'm going to be a little pessimistic and say we've absolutely seen delays, and unfortunately, we will continue to see them until we get better coordination on both sides. If you are a FERC watcher, you know there have been a number of transmission lines in particular, a number of studies that have gone on longer than they needed to, which then means the transmission line comes on later than it should. We've seen a very unfortunate and growing trend of a lack of coordination on the federal pipeline, the interstate natural gas pipeline setting process with what's happening at FERC with regard to the certificate policy or decision making, and then what's happening at the state level with regard to 401 permitting processes. So that is, if I could rank the challenges there from a regulatory and policy perspective, the market intersection issue is number one, and running a close second is infrastructure, in particular on the natural gas pipeline side.
So I'd like to do a shout out for the National Petroleum Council infrastructure study that Kevin and I and others in the room are all working on. I think you should all have very high expectations, because we need to have, as Colette says, a real reconciliation of a lot of these concerns. Okay, more questions. We have one up front, and then we'll go to the far corner.
Thank you. Now it's Aoyama from the Asahi Shimbun Japan's newspaper. I would like to repeat the previous question I asked. So I was wondering if any of you could comment on the geopolitical implications of the fact that U.S. becomes a net exporter of energy by 2020. Will that incline the U.S. toward a more isolationist unilateral approach, or not necessarily so?
Well, Kevin, you're on the Council of Foreign Relations, so I think we'll look to you
I'm
first.
a member, not an officer, or responsible for the content there. Let me just offer sort of a very simple thought. The U.S. is producing energy here to sell to markets overseas already. And to do that, they need a lot of the same things that they needed to receive market overseas producing energy to receive here, which is to say the defense of sea lanes, the stable and transparent sanctity of contracts, widespread promotion of democracy and capitalism to produce free societies of free owners, ideally, and mechanisms for addressing grievances with societies that are less free and less protective of private capital. So to say that we can pull back from the world now that we're comfortable with ourselves is a mistake. We're part of a connected price system, especially for oil and gas. Increasingly for gas, but especially for oil and liquids, and for that reason, no, I don't think you can say this justifies an isolationist posture. What it does do, though, is it could lead to some complacency on our domestic policy. It may make our lawmakers who previously quaked at the thought of an oil price shock less willing to consider the interests of industry that are truly important for preserving our long-term energy security and indeed the energy security of our partners. These can be peripheral things like trade. They can be questions of how we address multilateral frameworks for security. And some of those issues, they don't seem like oil and gas engineering issues or technology issues, but they're essential to creating stable frameworks for commerce and investment. And I do fear that with a growing sense of our own security, lawmakers may become less willing, policymakers writ large, may become less willing to look at some of these broader risks that adhere to the oil and gas system.
I just got to say, as someone who moderates like 70 panels a year, that was a great answer. You're really good at this. We have a question in the corner.
Yeah, I'm Ken Meyercord, a longtime avid reader of Colin Campbell's ASPO newsletter. And I got here a little late, so if this question has been answered, I apologize. If there is a massive shift to electric vehicles, I assume that means we're going to have to build a lot of power plants to charge all those batteries. Has anybody calculated the carbon balance versus our current petroleum-based transportation system if coal is the fuel that powers those let's say 50% of those new power plants?
Arshad, I think you referred to that. Why don't you unpack it a little bit?
Yeah, just unpack it. USNEA, U.S. National Electrification Assessment. Google that. The answer is there. It's not ready to be digested in a minute. But the main thing is we're making electricity with cleaner sources. You just saw that. I mean, if you look at today versus 10 years ago, I mean, climate question, I thought we should be proud of what has happened. Future, you may not be able to predict. Past is based on data. So look at every developing country, you do your own math, and look at every industrial country, how much emission has been reduced over the last 10 years and how much US has reduced. And predominantly it's because of natural gas. But that was a revolution of shale that led us to do that, and we'll do that even more. Look at if we have an enabling policy where we understand that we need both energy and we need capacity, which is we need to make sure that the energy is available when needed, then you will have nuclear will stay in the mix. You will have a future where you'll have a balanced resource. And if you look at where EVs are going, I'm very optimistic over the next 10 years on how engineering innovation with enabling policy and regulation will drive emission down in the US and worldwide. And if electric vehicle does happen, the study that has been done by EPRI, the study that has been done by Natural Resource Defense Council, NRDC, clearly shows what an electrified future, how it impacts emissions. And I'm going to end up with one last technology, since I'm a technology guy. It's early stage, but if we can make food with 90% less water, 90% less pesticide, 90% less land, and make it where you're eating it, that's called indoor agriculture. That's at an early stage right now. We may be sitting here 10 years from now and see how indoor agriculture changes the way we use energy and the way we use water.
And if I might, could I ask Arshad to, taking over your job, to talk a little bit about one thing. So Arshad said that EPRI doesn't engage in policy, but one thing that they do, which is significant, is they make a very important point to educate and engage with regulators at the state level and at the federal level. So I won't, a little knowledge is dangerous. So I want to ask Arshad to talk a little bit about EPRI's work with data analytics on AI and the potential for efficiencies through harnessing that ability.
When Colette, as a member of your board of directors, asks you a question, you make sure you answer that. But a quick, we have, it's not just our researchers. We partner with national labs, academic, but we have huge stakeholder engagement. NARUC has been a great, I mean, it's a ThinkPad. We need to understand policy so we can inform policy. And what we say is look at the data, look at the math. So if you think the current generation mix in the US doesn't reduce emission if you electrify transportation, do your own math. And if you look at where battery cost is going and where it was, you do your own math and come to your own conclusion. And what we are seeing right now is a society is driving towards lower emission. And emission is not just carbon. If you live in a disadvantaged community near a seaport, emissions is air quality. So society is driving for lower emission. I think we're seeing gas is an amazing discovery from a shale perspective that has caused a reduction of emissions. But we see electric vehicles, we see battery, we see indoor agriculture. With enabling policy and enabling regulation, these engineering innovations will drive us to a society where our GDP will grow, but we will use less energy. But don't forget about a world where there are more people who doesn't have electricity today than the number of people who didn't have electricity before Edison invented light bulb. Just let that sink into you. And then the global energy need will increase. So isn't it an amazing opportunity where we become more efficient, our GDP grows, we use less energy, but we are becoming a source to provide the additional energy to the people who needs that? I think that's what the AEO Outlook 2019 is showing, is that wonderful opportunity.
Kevin, and then we have probably time for 2 more questions.
Just want to add to something Arshad said. Indoor horticulture teaches a sort of cautionary lesson. And this, I think, gets to the question that was asked. The resource mix in the state of Colorado was still fairly coal-intensive at a time when marijuana was legalized, and that particular indoor agricultural activity drove up emissions because of the resource mix. When you look at things as an energy analyst, there's always surprises you didn't account for. So your best laid assumptions may go up in smoke.
He was waiting for that one. Second to last question, please.
Mark Finley with BP. Thanks again to all the panelists for their thoughtful comments, and especially to Kevin for introducing legalized marijuana into a discussion of energy. We've talked a lot about electric vehicles, but we haven't talked at all about autonomy. And so I'm interested in thinking about the panel's help in thinking through autonomy, both from a analytic and modeling perspective, but also from a strategic perspective. I mean, how should we think about it? Does it increase demand for miles traveled? Does it decrease it? Does it make it more efficient? Will they be electric? Will they not? What are the issues that we need to wrestle with when we think about introduction to the transport system?
So let's answer it from the AEO perspective first.
We're going to walk it around. Thank you.
That's a loaded question. First of all, we do actually have autonomous vehicles in the annual energy outlook, and we've been gradually implementing our capability. So currently, I mean, the short answer is we do see autonomous vehicles increasing VMT, and there's a number of reasons for that. Actually, our prior EIA, we did a side case where we looked at if, basically assuming there's a significant adoption of autonomous vehicles, what does the fuel mix do? But whether they're electric vehicle intensive or hybrid electric vehicle intensive, because they do have a pretty high power demand to operate all their power electronics. Really, no matter what, energy goes up due to just a much higher increase in vehicle miles traveled, because it's a lot easier to travel. There's a lot of we're called it deadhead miles, where the vehicle is operating on its own with nobody in it to go get your groceries, or whether to go to a parking structure to charge up, or regardless. But there could be, I mean, quite a few opportunities for improved efficiencies also for how they just drive smoother, which for very aggressive drivers in DC, they probably hate because someone's going the speed limit in front of them. So there's a lot of different ways it could affect. And I'm happy to take this conversation offline because we could talk about it for days. So we do model it. It is very important, and depending on also where research dollars go, that could also drive, I mean, literally drive, where these efficiencies could happen, because you could really have downsized engines, even just on conventional vehicles. You'd have boxes that weigh basically nothing. They just shuttle our packages around, and those are actually great opportunities for improved efficiency.
Any other autonomous?
Can I just, so you said something I think was very interesting. You said no matter what goes up, energy demand goes up. The attractiveness, I think the logic there is that the attractiveness of a cheaper transportation resource, mobility cheaper, and debottlenecked traffic, so you get a better experience. And for that matter, the efficiency gains lower the incremental costs in terms of fuel too, because take things like side view mirrors and all the window cowlings and things that create drag away in this perfectly autonomous vehicle world. That all sounds really like a good thing. But if the resource mix that fuels those vehicles has a different carbon intensity, then this potentially changes the equation. And in a carbon-regulated world, you get a very different answer. Did you model the sort of the carbon signature that comes with different scenarios, or?
Inherently model the carbon signature, not directly as the transportation sector. So maybe to clarify a little bit, the increased VMT almost always wins in terms of energy consumption. It's the same conversation when we're talking about even just fuel economy regulations, and you look at our AO, how our gasoline consumption goes down, it comes back up. And it's really as efficiency wins first, and then just increasing VMT as a whole really starts to take over. It's the same reason why like carpooling is the most efficient way you could cut your, like say, gasoline consumption with traveling. So with the VMT is really the winner there. I mean, we actually had published a study that showed like the different effects of increasing efficiency with downsized engines and vehicles, other aspects about smoothing your driving like characteristics, and the VMT aspect is still the biggest characteristic.
I'll make one comment, which is just a reminder that since our charge is to look at production and consumption, supply and demand, CO2 is always a derivative data point, so we always calculate the derivative, and that's how we can provide others with CO2 data in order for others to optimize and see how they want to drive things. So that's really a policy question, is if this particular view of the future creates this kind an emission level of X, do I want it to go that way or want it to go another direction? That's a policy question. So we are very active in our calculations of what CO2 will result from different production supply situations, but then others take that. So I don't know if you're aware of any particular studies that have done that. I'm sure people have looked at that, and I just don't know the references.
We have time for a final question from a very patient gentleman here in the middle. Right behind you is a mic. If you could raise your hand, you guys will meet each other. All right. Do we have a final question from anybody? I love when we just fundamentally sate the intellectual curiosity of a big crowd. So we have about 15 minutes for a break, which means you have 10 minutes for a break so that we can actually get back here and start the discussion of the short-term energy outlook. Just join me in thanking the administrator and our panelists for a great conversation. Restroom. But yeah, the main presentation is more about how
Okay, thanks so much, everybody. If you guys can come back and take your seats, we're going to get started with the second part of our program. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. This is the second part of our program today. I'm Blair Beasley. I am the acting director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Energy Project, and excited to turn our attention now to the January 2019 short-term energy outlook. There's no one really better to walk us through this than Tim Hess, who's the STIO product manager for the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Tim has held that position since November 2014 and joined EIA back in 2010 as a petroleum markets analyst. Prior to EIA, he worked for Baltimore Gas and Electric and has a master's in energy policy from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and a BA in economics from Michigan State University. So I'm going to turn the podium over to him to kind of walk through the January STIO, and then we'll have a panel discussion to follow.
Thanks, Blair, and thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting, and also thanks to all the analysts at EIA who work every month on the STIO to make it happen. So, So welcome to the STIO portion of the event, which is a new addition this year. I know many of you come to this event and are familiar with the AEO. Some of you also know STIO, but for those who don't, I wanted to give a very brief introduction to what STIO is. Following a brief overview of some highlights from the January STIO, we're going to have a panel discussion with Rick Smead from RBN Energy and James Edgar from Enbridge. And so there we'll be talking about infrastructure constraints and this STIO and how that all comes together. STIO is EIA's monthly forecast of energy supply, consumption, and prices through the end of the next calendar year. It's mostly focused on the U.S., but it does have a global oil market outlook component to it. As opposed to the AEO, which is a projection, STIO is a forecast. The difference between the two may seem trivial. However, it does matter for the results of the respective models produced. AEO focuses on a reference case, as we saw this morning, using current laws and regulations based on relationships and general equilibrium models that satisfy projected energy demand under a set of constraints. STIO uses a set of econometric equations based on historical data to forecast where EIA thinks energy markets are headed in the next 2 years. Because of the reliance on historical data and short-term trends, STIO relies significantly on analyst judgment to create its forecast, which is some of the issues we'll delve into in the panel discussion. So there are a few key points I'd like to focus on from the January STIO. One is that EIA forecasts crude oil prices to rise over the next 2 years, however, remain below the annual average levels seen from 2018. Second, EIA expects crude oil and natural gas production to continue to increase significantly in 2019 and 2020, albeit at slower rates than in 2018. Three, the United States is forecast to become a net exporter of total petroleum by the fourth quarter of 2020. And finally, EIA expects Henry Hub natural gas prices to remain slightly below $3 on an annual average basis through the forecast period. So we'll start by looking at crude oil prices. The left graph you see shows Brent and WTI spot prices. In general, EIA expects prices for both Brent and WTI to rise slightly in 2019 and 2020, with Brent averaging $61 per barrel in 2019 and $65 per barrel in 2020, which is up from December levels, but lower than the 2018 annual average. EIA expects WTI's price discount to Brent, which has been near $8 per barrel recently, to narrow starting in the second half of 2019. The narrowing spread between the two benchmark crudes reflects EIA's expectation that pipeline bottlenecks in the Permian Basin will be alleviated in the second half of 2019, allowing more Permian crude to flow to the U.S. Gulf Coast and bypass the Cushing, Oklahoma hub. It is always important when discussing crude oil price forecasts to note the significant uncertainty inherent in the task. The right graph shows EIA's WTI spot price forecast in the context of market-based uncertainty bands. EIA uses the prices and volatility measured in futures and options contracts to derive price levels associated with oil market participants' assessment of uncertainty in the coming months. This is not EIA's forecast, but simply a derivation of market expectations. It shows market participants can see price outcomes for WTI as high as $100 per barrel and as low as $30 per barrel by the end of this year. So this graph that you're looking at shows the world oil market balances with quarterly supply and consumption levels on the top panel, and the difference between the two, the quarterly average implied inventory builds or draws on the bottom panel. The world oil balance displays the major dynamic that support EIA's price forecast. For example, back in 2015, when supply was well above consumption and inventories were building, oil prices fell. Then, in 2017 and early 2018, falling inventory levels contributed to rising oil prices. In the forecast, EIA expects supply and consumption in global oil markets to be largely in balance. The balance is largely the result of rising non-OPEC supply, led by the United States, keeping pace with global oil demand growth, led by China, India, and the United States. As I mentioned, EIA expects the United States to continue to provide the bulk of the increase in global oil supply in the coming years. This slide looks more closely at U.S. crude oil production, which EIA forecasts will rise to 12.1 million barrels per day this year, and then to 12.9 million barrels per day in 2020. That's up from 10.9 million barrels per day last year. Additionally, total U.S. crude oil production is forecast to eclipse 13 million barrels per day by the end of 2020. EIA expects the Permian Basin to drive most of this growth, providing half of the total increase in U.S. crude oil production in 2019 and 2/3 of the total increase in U.S. crude oil production in 2020. The Permian share of U.S. growth rises in 2020 because as price constraints in that region, as lower wellhead prices are expected to rise relative to the WTI benchmark in that region, as transportation infrastructure constraints are expected to be alleviated beginning in the middle of this year. So briefly, this slide shows the U.S. petroleum trade balance. The U.S. is a net importer of crude oil, which is the blue area on the top, and a net exporter of refined petroleum products, the green area. The resulting balance is the yellow line, which is the total U.S. net oil imports. The key point here is that the net import number has been on a consistent downtrend in recent years, and EIA expects that to continue. As recently as the first quarter of 2018, the U.S. was a net importer on the order of 3 million barrels per day. In the forecast, however, on the back of modest declines in crude oil net imports and continuing strong increases in refined product exports, EIA expects that by the fourth quarter of 2020, the U.S. will be a net petroleum exporter. However, there's quite a bit of uncertainty inherent in this forecast because the net trade forecast is the output of a complex relationship of supply, demand, and price variables, not just in the United States, but globally. As you can see from the graph, net imports hover around 0 for most of 2020 before moving to a net export position in the fourth quarter of that year. But given uncertainty, it would not be surprising if a move to being a net exporter of petroleum happened before that time, or conversely, if the U.S. remained a slight net importer beyond the forecast period. So we'll shift to natural gas quickly. These graphs show EIA's forecast for natural gas supply and consumption over the next 2 years. The left graph shows annual average supply growth, which saw both record levels of growth and production in 2018. High growth is expected to continue this year, mostly driven by the Appalachia and Permian regions. Growth is expected to slow somewhat in 2020. The right graph shows the change in natural gas consumption in the forecast. After weather patterns drove strong increases in electric power sector and residential and commercial consumption last year, consumption growth is expected to flatten in 2019 and 2020 as weather is forecast to return to closer to normal. However, this forecast is highly weather dependent, as a very cold winter can contribute to high levels of residential and commercial consumption, and a hot summer can lead to high air conditioning demand use and increases in natural gas burn in the electric power sector. With supply growth outpacing demand growth in the STIO forecast, we expect 3 things to result. 1, U.S. exports of natural gas are forecast to increase. Natural gas storage injections are generally expected to outpace the 5-year average. And prices, which are largely driven by regional market dynamics, stay below $3 per MMBTU on an annual average basis. So this graph is similar to the one we showed earlier, but for natural gas, putting our forecast in the context of market-implied uncertainty bands. As I mentioned, the forecast is for prices at Henry Hub to stay below $3 on an annual average basis, only spiking when we see weather-related demand in the winter. And so before we move on to the panel portion of the session, I wanted to shift a little bit from our direct forecast and look at a slide that considers how EIA looks at infrastructure constraints. So in the AEO model, as was mentioned in the previous discussion, if the market sees a demand for infrastructure arising, it knows that need is there, and the model builds that infrastructure. However, in the STIO, basically if there's not a firm project announcement or construction already started, the 2-year time frame is too short to make that kind of assumption. So we have to follow those projects closely and look at kind of what's coming online. And to reflect infrastructure constraints in our models, EIA builds price discounts for producing regions into our production model. To inform our baseline forecast, EIA analyzes how different price outcomes arising from differing severities of takeaway capacity constraints might affect markets. These scenarios also help EIA identify signposts to watch to reassess our forecast. The results I'm presenting here are not an official EIA forecast, but rather scenarios that give a sense of the price sensitivities EIA considers and why it is important for us to consult with experts in these areas to help increase our understanding of the varying dynamics. So the base case you see in these 2 graphs here is the actual January STIO forecast for, on the left side graph, the Permian Basin for crude oil, and the Appalachia region for natural gas. In this baseline forecast for the Permian, EIA assumes Permian crude prices trade $8 below WTI Cushing prices during the first half of 2019. reflecting current takeaway capacity constraints. We then expect that to narrow to about $1 per barrel on average, lower than the WTI benchmark in 2020, when those constraints are no longer expected to exist. For Appalachia, EIA assumes that Marcellus producers get about 40 cents below Henry Hub prices through the forecast period. EIA looked at 2 cases to evaluate how production in these regions would differ under different price spread environments. In one case, we assume producers in each region receive the benchmark price, which we call here the no spread case. That producers in the Permian would receive WTI Cushing prices, and producers in Appalachia would receive Henry Hub prices. These would roughly represent kind of an unconstrained world. In this case, by the end of 2020, Permian crude oil production is about 100,000 barrels per day higher than in the January STIO base case, and Appalachia production of gas is about 2 BCF per day higher. In the other case, we looked at a widespread scenario, which we considered a persistent $15 per barrel discount for WTI Midland prices to WTI Cushing prices. And for gas, that would be a $1 per MMBTU discount for Marcellus producers relative to Henry Hub. This case would represent a more constrained world. In this case, by the end of 2020, Permian crude oil production is about 300,000 barrels per day lower than in the January STIO, and Appalachia gas production is about 3 BCF per day lower than in the January STIO. So in these cases, Permian production varies about 400,000 barrels per day between the no spread and widespread cases, and Appalachian gas varies by about 5 BCF per day. So those conclude my very brief formal remarks on STIO. So I wanted to invite Rick and James up to the stage for a quick discussion. So thanks for both of you. Thanks to both of you for making the trip up and to share your opinions with EIA. James has been with Enbridge since 2010 in various commercial and financial roles, and is currently Director of Strategic Planning and Economic Evaluation for Enbridge's U.S. and Canadian gas transmission business. His previous roles include Director, Finance and Director for Risk Assessment for various affiliates of Enbridge. His current responsibilities include development of new ventures, M&A evaluation, fundamental market intelligence, and corporate strategy. Prior to joining Enbridge, James worked with TC Energy, Deloitte, and Koch Industries. James is currently the chairman of the Education Foundation of Harris County in Houston, Texas, funding programs that impact thousands of students throughout 25 independent school districts. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada. Rick Smead is Managing Director of Advisory Services for RBN Energy. He specializes primarily in the natural gas sector, offering expert policy analysis and advice, litigation support, and strategic advice with respect to gas pipelines, potential supplies, and market initiatives. His background includes over 9 years as director with Navigant Consulting and over 3 decades in the natural gas industry. Most recently, he has been deeply involved in opportunities for the use of the nation's natural gas abundance, including power generation, LNG exports, and gas-to-liquid technology. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Maryland and a law degree from George Washington University. So, welcome back to the area.
Thanks, Jim.
So, again, thank you both so much for being here. So, you know, I wanted to I guess, start the conversation. We mentioned the Permian, and that's obviously where a lot of the growth is coming from. Talking about the Permian, so one of the things we looked at was how infrastructure constraints are currently affecting the growth in crude oil production there, and how some lower prices are affecting production in the region, and that we do expect that to be alleviated kind of come middle of this year. But then there are other constraints that could arise, that from NGL and natural gas takeaway capacities. So I kind of wanted to open up the discussion with, how, once the crude oil constraints are alleviated, how do you see that then, will constrained natural gas and NGL capacity have an effect? And I also just, any other thoughts you had on anything that was said to open, please feel free.
It's really kind of a Rubik's Cube, and we call it cascading interactivity or interdependency, because basically, even if you have the sufficient capacity to move all of the crude oil that's produced, if you can't move the gas that was produced with the crude oil, then you either have to stop producing the crude oil or flare the gas. They're reaching about the limits of what they can really flare in the Permian. It's around half a BCF a day now, I think. It's a lot. And meanwhile, there's some strange bureaucratic kinks. You'd think in Texas, everything would go nice and smoothly for energy stuff, but it actually doesn't necessarily. And so basically gas infrastructure has been constraining the ability to develop crude oil. And so at one point, the Permian gas prices because of the associated gas actually went negative. It was down at zero, then it actually went negative briefly, and then related to that is natural gas liquids that are produced with the gas. There's a point past which a pipeline can't accept really rich gas, so this stuff has to be extracted. There's plenty of extraction processing capability in the basin at the field level, so that can get done, and the natural gas liquids that are extracted as what's called Y grade, or the combined stuff, can be moved. But Texas fractionation capacity, primarily at Mont Belvieu outside of Houston, is going to be at its limit by 2020. Meaning you can have this stuff, but if you can't separate it into propane, ethane, butane, and so forth, it's not useful, so it loses economic value. Everybody wants to shove it back in the gas stream, and it doesn't quite fit. So all of these affect each other, and unless they're in balance, the ultimate victim is going to be the pace of crude oil development. So it's a real juggling act. I mentioned the bureaucratic kink that the producers ran into in Texas, where they didn't want to flare raw gas at the wellhead because it's very rich. They're burning all those valuable natural gas liquids. So they said, well, why don't we take the gas over to the processing plants, extract the product, and then just burn the residual pure methane in these high-tech flares we have at the plants. So it's going to be cleaner. We'll keep all this product. Doesn't that make sense? The Railroad Commission said, yeah, that really makes sense, but we're not in charge of that. The Texas Council on Environmental Quality is, so go see them. Went to them and said, what a great idea, we'll study it. Should take about 18 months, which is about the duration of the crisis. So, so we have bureaucracy in Texas too, we just don't publicize it.
Well, the Permian is kind of a unique place, right? We've got gas that's supposed to go down to Mexico. We've got LNG plants proposed all along the Gulf Coast. So you've kind of got this weird dynamic of new markets being developed at Agua Dulce. There's a story about leaving too much liquids in the gas, and a cookie bakery started burning cookies because we were leaving the liquids in and the gas was too hot. So, so there's all kinds of random things that when your phone rings, you aren't sure what's going to happen.
So, I mean, I guess one of the things that then, I mean, Rick, you kind of mentioned the regulatory environment in Texas. One of the other things that EIA has started to think about is, are these issues are we going to see these issues in North Dakota? We've kind of identified, Bakken as another place where you could see some gas processing capacity issues. I know they've recently added a little bit of gas processing capacity there, but maybe, that's not till, that situation isn't resolved more fully until the end of 2019. I guess, how long do you guys see that situation persisting up there?
It's hard to say. It really depends on the pace of development because, as you know, Bakken crashed when oil prices went down. In fact, there was a show with Don Johnson called Blood and Money, I think, or something like that, that was all about, it was Dallas done in Bismarck and Williston. And so it was this soap opera about the boom, and by the time it was on the air, there was nobody drilling in North Dakota. So, they missed their sweet spot. But now it is starting to surge, and if it ramps up the way it ramped up before, we're very short of capacity. And unlike Texas, there's not a big existing infrastructure able to pick everything up and move it once you have the product either. There's the Alliance rich gas line that runs down through North Dakota, but it's running full. So I'm not sure what the duration will be. It'll really depend on the pace of development.
Right, and actually, quite interestingly, that Alliance line, they ran an open season last year that wasn't successful. So the appetite for the market, where we thought it was there, it wasn't, just flat out wasn't.
Yeah. So do you know what, where, maybe why there was no demand for that at all, or?
Well, there's no surprise here. It was a surprise to us. Else we wouldn't run the open season. The feedback we got was pretty light. Just that it cost more to move the product than it was worth at the end of the day.
Yeah, one of the things that happens when we're going through this cycle, producers never wanted to sign up for firm transportation on any kind of pipeline in the past. And as Marcellus grew and everybody started worrying about being constrained, suddenly they started doing that. They ran out and down in Haynesville, some of them made gigantic firm transportation commitments. Turned out to be dumb. And so the guys that made those all got fired. So then their successors came in right about the time prices cratered, and somebody said, "Hey, you want to sign up for some new firm transportation?" And they looked in their files and said, "Well, no." And so it's a really difficult contracting situation now.
So I mean, I guess you're thinking about, signing up for, well, shifting gears a little bit, but one of the areas where some of the biggest constraints we've seen is New England. I mean, of course, it sits pretty close to the most prolific gas play in the United States. But getting gas into that region has been an issue. But then you bring into the question of, well, do they need the gas all the time or only during times of kind of peak load, right? So so kind of how should people in New England look at this? Should the focus be, on getting more pipeline capacity in there more broadly, or maybe more just other sources of generation?
Well, I'd say James has had a dog in this fight for a while, so I'll sit back for a minute here.
Sure. So, I mean, if you look at the Northeast in general, it's a little bit more difficult for permitting and siting. And we've had some commitments by local governments to reduce emissions, and we've got power markets, which are obviously driving a huge part of that. And it all kind of knits together. And, when we put pipe in the ground, we put it in the ground for 40 to 80 years. And really, as a power producer, you only want to sign a 3-year contract, and that gets pretty tough. So you've got a consumer, a power plant that wants to generate and wants the pipeline capacity. We can't build it on spec as much as I'd love to, but it's not made out of straw, so we can't pick it up once it's in very easily. And so you've got these policy issues government policy issues that don't align with the way that the markets actually work, that don't align with the way that we build infrastructure. So that sort of misfit gets pretty tricky to try and manage. And we've had to your point earlier with Texas being confusing sometimes. We've had facilities rejected for water. We've had facilities rejected for all sorts of reasons. And that unpredictability is just a tough place to do business. And at the end of the day, as a conservative pipeline infrastructure company, we have to be pretty careful what we do.
Well, ironically, Spectra, now part of Enbridge, had by far the best grassroots on the ground interaction with the 6 states in New England, and ultimately did get a 6-state deal done to fund new pipeline through electric distribution company rates, and then parcel it out to the generators as needed, so you didn't have to wait for the generators to sign up. And it was all working great until the Massachusetts Supreme Court decided that it was illegal in Massachusetts, the largest market, and they took the authority away from the Department of Public Utilities. The irony there is that project and Kinder Morgan's project did not fail because of environmental resistance or New York resistance or anything. They failed for lack of subscription, for lack of ability to fund the commitment. And a lot of that is a disconnect with how the power market works in New England, with the incentives that generators have and so forth. But having said that, does pipeline capacity make the most sense? No, not for the whole load by far, because if you look at the 2016 and 2017 winters, New England's gas prices stayed below Henry Hub all winter. So they do have a strategy in New England, don't have winter. And yet, when they've had winter, they had a world of hurt in terms of prices. And part of that is that is primarily electric prices. The gas consumers aren't paying those high prices. Their gas is coming through firm transportation held by the local distribution companies. They're paying Marcellus prices. It's the guys at the margin, who are the power generators working in the space available market, that see the really high prices. The real high prices don't last very long, but then they trigger a cascade of power pricing in the way their bidding is done in the power market. But that's what really hits consumers. So there are power market questions to ask, but ultimately, if you think about a short haul, like couple 100-mile pipeline fix up there, would be about $1 an MCF, $1 a million BTUs at 100% load factor. That just typically. If you only need it 3 days, that's $120 a decatherm for what you actually got. And the rest of the year, the pipelines just work. So other solutions, alternative fuel, demand response, and LNG can all be used to supplement some optimally sized. They need more pipe, but not enough to serve the peak.
Right. Yeah. That would be a mistake.
Yeah.
And it depends what the end goal is, right? When we set policy, is the end goal environmental? What is it? So let's pretend for a sec that it's solely environmental, to cut emissions. Well, I mean, last winter, in the 13-day cold snap, in the Northeast, they burned fuel oil. And the emissions from that was the equivalent of putting 650,000 cars on the road.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, erased all of the 2017 savings for emissions. So if the end goal is really economic, then you've got to find a better solution, and gas is part of it, fuel probably part of it for emergency measures, LNG, but then you've got siting issues, and it's an interesting time for sure.
The origin of the New England crisis really goes back to 2004, when gas-fired combined cycles have been built at a breakneck pace up there, and Maritimes have been built down from Nova Scotia. And everybody looked at it, and this worked because it basically balanced the market. It backfed the market so that nobody needed firm capacity. But there wasn't enough gas coming into Maritimes. And that, in 2004, was the first time that things got short, and they've been struggling with it ever since. So if you can find a way to have Maritimes be full, there's not much of a problem. But there's one LNG solution to that, but that's it, really.
Great. So as you know, we talked about EIA's, some of EIA's modeling efforts, particularly with our production models and the prices we feed into those models, and how, you know, one of the things is we always used to think that Henry Hub was kind of the be-all and end-all of prices, and then we fed that through all of our models. But you know, we started over the past couple of years, we started to see disconnects with what our model was producing and you know, what we were actually seeing, and then we had the thought that, oh well, maybe, you know, maybe we should be feeding in some of these other prices, and so we started with looking at, you know, Dominion South prices in our gas model. So, I mean, beyond that, are there other, you know, one kind of how important is Henry Hub still as a benchmark, or should we, you know, be looking to more regional prices, you know, throughout the country to feed into our models, and kind of two, what signposts should we watch to kind of answer that question for us? What should we be looking for?
Good question. Want me to start?
Sure.
First, Henry is still really important, but Henry is evolving to becoming a consumption center because of LNG exports and petrochem and so forth. And so it will typically now have prices that are higher than a lot of prices north of it forever. And that then does create some sort of weird situations. If there are not pipeline constraints, between the various producing areas in Henry still works just fine as a measurement. Then you have to have some indication of what the basis differentials are. If there are constraints, then everything goes wonky the way it's been in Marcellus in the past. So I think where we see things today, there's not, the reason Henry was created was because it was basically frictionless. There was so much pipeline access and takeaway that you didn't have infrastructure-driven discontinuities in the pricing there. That's still true at Henry. It starts getting untrue as you move away from Henry, which means that paying attention to the other regions is very important, but there's really no other region that makes sense as being kind of the pricing hub per se. But we will continue to see regional discontinuities caused by momentary infrastructure constraints. But it still works, and Henry actually is becoming not just the natural gas center of the United States, but the natural gas center of the world.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Gulf Coast LNG is predicated on Henry Hub pricing. It's really an essential part of, you know, the trading world, and then the basis around. I think you should look regionally, but because they're so much influenced by infrastructure, by local weather, by, you know, you name it, it can be really hard to forecast with any sort of clarity. But as we do see a lot of contracts structured to Henry Hub, you are going to see the financial markets react a little bit differently as the liquidity changes.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, kind of circling back now to the Permian that we've been interested in is, you know, we've seen gas exports increase to Mexico. That's mostly been kind of out of South Texas, more so than the Permian. But you know, you know, a lot of the reason that you haven't seen anything on from the Permian is not because of the Permian itself necessarily, but because of what's happening on the Mexican side of the border, or, you know, lack of what's happening on the Mexican side of the border. You know, do you see that situation changing anytime soon, of, you know, build out of takeaway capacity in Mexico to kind of increase the pipeline exports out of the Permian side of Texas, or, you know, is that gas going to probably end up going to the Gulf instead?
I think at least our analysis says that, and the issue has been simply that all the gas is in the West and most of the demand is in the East. And Mexico did not have the infrastructure internally to move it across Mexico, even though there were quite a few cross-border pipelines built in West Texas into Mexico. And we've got lots of capacity in South Texas to Mexico. And so, in essence, with, gosh, we've got about 4 BCF a day imminent within the next 2 years of cross-Texas capacity going into service, and probably ultimately there's something like 14 BCF a day proposed by various people. That's all to get gas to Agua Dulce and to Brownsville and to the whole South Texas corner there, both for LNG exports and for supplying those East and Southeast Texas export projects. We certainly believe that's going to be a more viable way to go than waiting for, especially since President Obrador isn't real enthusiastic about the industry. So having anything work real fast in Mexico right now in the energy sector would probably be unpredictable.
Right. And, you know, with the activity of the CFE over the last couple of years, you know, they've been building power infrastructure primarily, and the consensus, at least around my desk, is, you know, they fundamentally need the molecules. One way or the other, they need the molecules. So, you know, the way the pipes infrastructure goes to from South Texas down to southern Mexico, you know, you've got a whole bunch of investments sitting there, and they fundamentally need the infrastructure built in Mexico.
Yeah. Some of the original, I should say, a lot of the original development into Mexico from East Texas was premised on Eagle Ford being really strong, which is down in that part of Texas. Then it wasn't, as oil prices crashed and Eagle Ford development dropped off. But everybody felt pretty secure because there were all these big long line pipelines running along the coast. But the problem is that they telescope the wrong way. They start really skinny at the bottom and get fatter and fatter as they go north, because that's what they used to do for a living. So it's like pushing a pig through a straw. And so there was no way to supply that.
No, go ahead.
Oh, so I was going to say, it's almost time to move to Q&A, but I guess I wanted to end this part of the discussion with the question, you know, we've talked about the Permian, we've talked about New England, some of the well-known infrastructure constraints. What are we not thinking about that we should be? You know, what are some of the potential constraints that could be on the horizon over the next year, or 2 years, or 5 years, or?
There are so many possibilities. I mean, having infrastructure matched what the market needs. The issue now that we've been facing now for the last decade has been tremendous geographic relocation of where supply and demand are. Just enormous fundamental changes, and so there will just continue to be kind of unpredictable quirks in that, or one product affecting another product. We've got a big fight going on right now in Austin about the Houston Ship Channel, where for oil and product exports, Houston wants to become a major container port, and so in doing that, to bring these 1,100-foot container ships up the ship channel, you can't have anything else moving at the time, which would start impairing energy exports, which then could go out of Corpus Christi, but at some point you start losing capacity in the whole combined system. And so there are lots and lots of people fighting with each other over that. So stuff like that.
Well, then start thinking about, you know, we've got corporate risk profiles, and you know, use PG&E as the poster child for uh-oh. And you know, when you've got $2 billion of insurance and you've got $30 billion of liability for something you don't think you did, but somebody said you might have done it, that's not tenable for anybody. No corporate entity is going to enter that, stay in that. It's not worth it. So we've got a changing environment, but switching to LNG for a sec, let's think about the international nature of LNG and just think about the credit impacts. You know, some people get very used to dealing with, let's say, Pakistan as an example, and that's a pretty far cry from North America. So, and the credit quality, and we've been working on those contract issues and all of that, but I wouldn't say it's there. We've got companies like Cheniere leading the way, and Sempra, but it's still a bit of a challenge, and the people or organizations tend to want to gravitate to what they know, what's safe, reliable, and delivers cash flows on an expected basis.
Okay, so I wanted to, I guess, at this point, open it up to audience Q&A. So just please state your name and affiliation and ask away. Gentleman down in front.
Ken Meyercord, no affiliation other than growing up in Texas. One constraint on the Permian, as I understand it, is what to do with the wastewater generated by hydraulic fracturing. Can you talk a little bit about that? It seems amazing that they can't use water in a semi-desert. and in this regard, I hate to mention it, but I have a friend who works in the Permian who won't drink the tap water.
Well, yeah, water disposal is a huge issue. In Marcellus, the quantities of water were such that they're able to reprocess the vast bulk of it now from gas development in the Northeast. But in the Permian, as I understand it, the volumes are just too high to do that. The traditional answer in Texas and Oklahoma has been deep disposal wells. And that's been the culprit in some of the seismic activity that people have gotten excited about. So basically, it's just a huge issue. The thing about water disposal, though, is ultimately, over the longer term, it's only money and plumbing. It can be handled. And so it depends as it gets big and it becomes part of the plan. All of the really active companies have it at the very top of their priorities, both in terms of water disposal and water sourcing, because if they can clean it up and reuse it, then that's saving, as you said, water in a desert is kind of valuable, and you've got to get it from somewhere. So it's a huge priority for the companies active out there to find solutions.
Yeah, and I can't say that I'm an expert in that, but having looked at the odd water transportation company, it is tough because you can lay those lines in the ditch. You don't need a whole lot of permits for it. But again, what do you do with it at the end of the day? So the recycling is the one I've seen tried to be used more often than not.
And actually, I'm not sure I would have drunk the water in Midland before this started.
Hi, Jenny Mandel with ENE News. Does the EIA model show changes to price volatility? And what do the projections show as far as increased volatility in natural gas prices with LNG exports? So I see that the ultimate price, the yearly price is tracking, roughly the same. But are there volatility changes?
We haven't. Looking at historical volatility, most of the volatility we've seen in natural gas has been more related to weather than anything else. And to the size when you get a big cold snap across the northern United States, that's the biggest contributor to volatility. In terms of LNG, we haven't seen anything to that regard. Prices were actually, as LNG ramped up through last year, price volatility was actually quite low. Causality is hard to kind of suss out there, but it's we did see low price volatility last year as those ramped up.
To go to your point earlier about hub versus more regional prices, you're seeing most of the vol show up in the regional prices than you are in hub.
Yeah, driven by infrastructure constraints. Right. But yeah, and with LNG, the great thing about LNG exports is that unless you have an upset, it's a very predictable load. And if you have a very predictable, steady load, it doesn't cause price volatility. One looming element over time is as more and more coal plants retire, and you get less gas to coal competition, you get less dispatchable generation competition. You have to start finding other sources of demand that will respond to prices and sort of damp out volatility. But look at this last year, where went through the summer and gas generation went crazy because of low prices. Nobody injected gas into storage because storage couldn't compete because the futures prices for the winter were too low. So we went into the winter short of storage. Suddenly in late October, early November, the market realized this, said, mother of God, and the futures prices for January and February went through the roof. Then it took them about, I don't know, what, 3 weeks or so to say, I don't know what I was thinking, and the whole market went back down. So to a large extent, we still have a market that is learning how to live in today's world, and the more it learns to live in today's world, the less you'll see stuff like that, quite honestly.
You think?
Yeah, I do.
I think.
Hi,
So,
yeah, Katie Dill, EIA. I have a question, maybe primarily for the Enbridge panelists, but anyone can chime in. And it's about infrastructure, but maybe from the opposite side, not building new for takeaway capacity, but about the old infrastructure that's, an important part of bringing gas, particularly from the Northeast down to the Gulf Coast. And with the age of that infrastructure approaching, 70, if not, and you just said 80 was kind of, 40 to 80 was your link, right? And with the recent explosion on the pipeline from, that was built, I think, in 1952, like, how big of an issue, or how much is your company worrying about old infrastructure in addition to new projects?
So across our systems, we've got an extensive infrastructure evaluation program. So running integrity runs of ILIs and various other integrity digs. And it's a system predicated on everything from when the steel was rolled to how many molecules have been through it, how old it is, and reputation of the company that did the steel work, the installation. It's sort of an information-based decision-making process, and I would say if you were to ask anybody in any part of Enbridge what their biggest concern is I don't want anything. We want to run a safe and reliable system, and any time we miss that mark is an embarrassment. So our number one priority is safety, followed by reliability.
Questions?
So, if there are no more questions, I wanted to just. Oh, sorry. So, I was wondering.
Hi, Scott Salmon with Shell.
Yeah.
Looking at the Appalachia region chart, and I think it applies in some of the others, but with as much as $1 or $2, looking out in terms of the price differential between a Henry Hub, does the ethane storage idea or the growth of industrial capacity or maybe the promise of future pipelines, is any of that enough to actually change that differential?
Sure, it can be. Obviously, if ethane doesn't have to be carried by the gas stream, then that starts alleviating capacity constraints, and it is simply pipeline capacity constraints that are causing the big price differential. We've got enough projects approved, under construction, or in place now to pretty much handle the capacity needs out of Appalachia till about 2022 or so, I think. It's more or less in balance to get gas out to markets that it wants to go to. But unfortunately, a lot of that capacity goes into the mid-continent, where the gas wanders around like a lost tribe because it can't get to any market that wants to burn gas. And so there is that, but that's starting to get relieved by different expansions in the West and the mid-continent. But basically, it's more or less okay. But anything that can cause higher levels of local demand for ethane or natural gas would do a tremendous amount to alleviate the price differential. If you had more extensive power generation, or if somebody wanted to build a gigantic ethane cracker up there, I heard somebody did that once and wanted to do that, that would all have that effect.
So I guess, Warren, did you want to say something about that?
Warren Lechewski, also with EIA. So for the STIO, it's very difficult to bake in something like a cracker or an ethane storage facility because our time horizon, and this is the January STIO, only goes out to December 2020, right? So anything that would change within that time span has already kind of been baked into the assumptions that drive the model. But in the annual energy outlook that we presented earlier today, we actually have a kind of co-credit for liquids that are produced along with natural gas in the field, right? So it kind of generates a semi-subsidy for gas production that then is recovered at the gas plants and comes back as a net back to the producer. And in the annual energy outlook, we would actually look at where demand is going for energy, because that's something that's semi-predictable, right? You take the petrochemical industry, you take the export numbers, you start lining all of that up, and it generates a production curve that then generates the revenue that will go back to the producer. So in those cases, we can bake in those kinds of assumptions and get some kind of a response in the model for production. In the STIO, that is really, like I said, it's too short of a time horizon to make those kinds of assumptions.
Any other questions out there? If not, Rick Smead, James Edgar, thank you again very much for sharing your opinions with the EIA. Appreciate it.
So briefly, we just want to thank everyone again for coming. Thank the EIA administrator and her staff for bringing AEO 2019 and the January STIO here for a discussion. I thought it was a great conversation, and thank you all for braving the rain for those who came in person and for everyone who joined online. So thanks again.